In the spring of 1851, two unmarried twin sisters from one of Alabama's wealthiest plantation families were discovered to be pregnant at the same time. The scandal would have been significant enough on its own in antebellum Southern society, where women's virtue was supposedly sacred. But when it was revealed that both women had been impregnated by the same enslaved man, a 24-year-old named Samuel, whom they had been sharing between them for nearly 2 years, the case became one of the most disturbing examples of how slavery corrupted everyone it touched. The sisters, Caroline and Catherine Whitfield, were not victims in this story. They were perpetrators who used their absolute power over Samuel to fulfill desires that violated every social convention of their time. What they did to him, what they did to each other, and what happened when their secret was exposed would shake Alabama's plantation society and reveal truths about slavery that most white Southerners preferred to ignore. Before we descend into this tale of power, exploitation, and the destruction it caused, hit that subscribe button, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments, because what you're about to hear is one of the most disturbing stories of how absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is Epoch of Fear, where history's darkest truths refuse to stay buried. Whitfield Hall was one of the grandest plantations in Sumter County, Alabama, situated about 60 miles west of Montgomery on nearly 4,000 acres of prime cotton-growing land. The plantation had been established in 1827 by Jonathan Whitfield, who had made his fortune in cotton and enslaved over 300 people by the 1850s. Jonathan had died in 1849, leaving the plantation to his widow Martha and their 5 children. The twin daughters, Caroline and Catherine, were born in 1827, making them 24 years old in 1851. They had 3 brothers, 2 older and 1 younger, who managed the plantation's business operations. In the hierarchical and strictly controlled society of the antebellum South, unmarried women of the planter class lived under severe restrictions. They were expected to remain pure until marriage, to be modest and submissive, to occupy themselves with domestic arts and religious devotion. Any hint of sexual impropriety could destroy a woman's reputation and marriage prospects permanently. This made the Whitfield twins' behavior even more shocking when it was eventually discovered, because they had been systematically violating every rule their society imposed on women of their class. Caroline and Catherine were identical twins, inseparable since childhood, known throughout the county for their beauty and their closeness. They dressed alike, shared a bedroom even as adults, finished each other's sentences in the way twins sometimes do. They had received the education typical for wealthy Southern women, learning French and music and needlework, being trained to manage a household and enslave domestic servants. Multiple suitors had pursued them over the years, but both had rejected all marriage offers, preferring to remain together rather than be separated by marriage. The family and community assumed this devotion to each other was touching sisterly affection. What no one understood was that the twins' bond had aspects that were deeply unhealthy, a shared obsession with controlling and dominating others that would eventually manifest in terrible ways. Samuel was purchased in 1849 at an estate sale in Mobile, Alabama. He was 22 years old at the time, had been born enslaved on a Louisiana plantation, and had been sold multiple times through no fault of his own, but simply because of his owner's financial situations. He was described in the sale documents as intelligent, skilled in carpentry and blacksmithing, physically strong and healthy. He sold for $1,200, a high price that reflected his perceived value. Jonathan Whitfield purchased Samuel, intending to use him in the blacksmith shop at Whitfield Hall. But Jonathan died just months after Samuel's arrival, and the management of enslaved people passed to Martha Whitfield and her children. In early 1850, Caroline and Catherine requested that Samuel be reassigned from the blacksmith shop to work as their personal servant. They claimed they needed someone strong to help with various tasks around the main house and gardens. Martha saw no reason to refuse, and Samuel was moved to the house, given a small room in the attic, and instructed to obey the twins in all things. What happened next was systematic sexual exploitation, though that term did not exist in 1850, and the concept was barely acknowledged. Enslaved people had no legal right to refuse any command from their owners, including sexual commands. The psychological and emotional damage this caused Samuel is impossible to fully measure, but testimony later revealed that he was severely traumatized, existing in a state of constant terror and dissociation. The twins' behavior toward each other also became increasingly disturbed. They were not just sharing Samuel out of necessity, but actively enjoying the shared nature of the exploitation. They would watch each other with him, would discuss him between themselves, would compete over who could exert more control or elicit stronger reactions. There was a psychosexual dynamic between the twins themselves, an intimacy that went beyond normal sisterly affection, though whether it was overtly sexual between them or simply deeply enmeshed codependency is unclear from historical records. Other enslaved people in the household knew something disturbing was happening. They saw Samuel being summoned to the twins' room, saw him emerge hours later exhausted and distressed. They heard sounds through the walls, but they said nothing, because speaking up would have brought punishment on themselves with no possibility of helping Samuel. The twins faced a catastrophic situation. Pregnancy outside of marriage would destroy their reputations and their family's standing. Being pregnant by an enslaved man was infinitely worse, a violation of the racial hierarchy that the entire Southern social system was built upon. Their first instinct was concealment. They began wearing looser clothing, avoiding social situations, making excuses for why they felt unwell. They told their mother Martha that they were suffering from chronic digestive ailments and preferred to take meals in their room. For a few months, this worked. But by April, their condition was becoming physically obvious. Their mother finally insisted on having them examined by the family physician, Dr. Robert Chambers. Dr. Chambers confirmed what Martha had begun to suspect. Both daughters were approximately 5 months pregnant. Martha Whitfield demanded to know who the father was. The twins initially refused to answer, but Martha was not a woman to be defied. She threatened to cast them out of the house, to disinherit them, to expose them publicly, unless they told her the truth. Under this pressure, Catherine broke. The truth. which emerged years later through testimony from other enslaved people who witnessed parts of what happened, was more brutal. Samuel was taken into the woods by Martha Whitfield's two oldest sons, Thomas and Jonathan Jr., along with the plantation overseer. They tied him to a tree and whipped him savagely, extracting a false confession that he had forced himself on the Whitfield sisters. Then they castrated him, a horrific mutilation designed to punish his supposed sexual crime. Finally, they hanged him from a tree, leaving his body to hang for several hours as a warning to other enslaved men about what happened if they crossed racial boundaries. Samuel's body was eventually cut down and buried in an unmarked grave in the plantation's forest. The enslaved people who were forced to dig the grave and bury him were threatened with similar fates if they ever spoke about what had happened. The official records of Whitfield Hall noted Samuel as a runaway, marked him as a financial loss, and made no further mention of him. A man who had been tortured, mutilated, and murdered for the crime of being repeatedly raped by his owners was erased from history as if he had never existed. Meanwhile, Caroline and Catherine were transported to Mississippi under cover of their supposed illness. They spent 5 months in isolation on a small property managed by a distant relative who asked no questions and accepted the story that the twins were recovering from illness. In September 1851, Catherine gave birth to a boy with light brown skin and features that mixed African and European ancestry. A third possibility, mentioned in one fragmentary letter, is that they were taken to New Orleans and sold into the city's mixed-race community, where light-skinned enslaved people commanded higher prices and where their origins would be lost. Whichever fate the children met, they were removed from their mothers' lives completely. Caroline and Catherine were not allowed to keep or even see their babies beyond the immediate aftermath of birth. The Whitfield family was determined to erase all evidence of what had happened. The twins returned to Alabama in October 1851, thinner and changed, but with no visible pregnancy or children. The official story was that they had been ill with a chronic condition, but had recovered through rest and treatment at the Mississippi property. Most of the community accepted this explanation, though rumors circulated that something scandalous had occurred. The twins' behavior after their return was notably changed. They were no longer inseparable, no longer finished each other's sentences, no longer presented a united front to the world. They occupied separate bedrooms for the first time in their lives. They barely spoke to each other, avoiding eye contact, moving through the house like strangers. The psychological impact of what they had done, of what had been done to their children, of Samuel's death, which they surely knew about, had broken the bond between them. Catherine developed what was described as melancholia, what we would now recognize as severe depression. She spent days in her room, refused to eat properly, wept for hours without apparent cause. She began attending religious services obsessively, speaking about sin and redemption and the punishment awaiting those who violated God's laws. In 1853, she attempted suicide by taking laudanum, a tincture of opium that was commonly available in the 19th century. She survived, but was never mentally stable afterward, existing in a kind of fog of grief and guilt until her death in 1859 at age 32, officially from pneumonia, but possibly from another suicide attempt or simply from giving up on living. Caroline's response was different, but equally dysfunctional. She became hard, cold, actively cruel to the enslaved people at Whitfield Hall. She would order whippings for minor infractions, would separate families by demanding enslaved people be sold away, would inflict psychological torments that suggested she was trying to punish others for the guilt she felt about what she had done. She married in 1854, a union to a neighboring planter that was arranged more for financial consolidation than affection. She bore 3 legitimate children in that marriage, but servants reported that she showed no affection toward them, treated them coldly, seemed unable to connect with them emotionally. Martha Whitfield took the family secrets to her grave in 1862. On her deathbed, she confessed to her local pastor, Reverend Samuel Boyd, asking for absolution for the sin of covering up her daughter's transgressions. Reverend Boyd later recorded in his private journal, which survived in church archives, that Mrs. Whitfield had confessed that her daughters had debased themselves with one of the family's property, and that the resulting unfortunate situation had been handled through sending the girls away and removing the enslaved man permanently. Reverend Boyd wrote that he granted absolution, but was troubled by the case, noting that while Mrs. Whitfield showed remorse for the scandal, she showed no particular remorse for the death of the enslaved man or the fate of the mixed-race children. The Civil War came in 1861, disrupting plantation society and eventually destroying it. Whitfield Hall continued operating through the war, though with reduced labor, as enslaved men were conscripted to work on Confederate fortifications, and as some enslaved people escaped to Union lines when the opportunity arose. When the war ended and slavery was abolished, the formerly enslaved people of Whitfield Hall were freed. Many left immediately, wanting nothing to do with the place and people who had oppressed them. Some stayed, having nowhere else to go, becoming sharecroppers on the same land they had worked as slaves. It was during the chaos of Reconstruction that the story of Carolyn, Catherine, and Samuel began to emerge publicly. Formerly enslaved people, no longer subject to punishment for speaking, began telling their stories. Multiple people who had been enslaved at Whitfield Hall testified in various contexts about what they had witnessed. A woman named Harriet, who had been a house servant, gave testimony to a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1866, describing how the Whitfield twins had abused Samuel, how he had been taken into the woods and killed, how the twins had been sent away and returned without the babies everyone knew they had been carrying. Similar testimony came from others. A man named Isaac, who had been forced to help bury Samuel's body, described the location and the condition of the corpse, the evidence of castration and hanging. A woman named Ruth, who had been at the Mississippi property when the twins gave birth, described the babies being taken away and never seen again. The testimony was consistent across multiple witnesses who had no reason to coordinate their stories and every reason to tell the truth about what they had endured. This testimony was documented by Freedmen's Bureau agents, by journalists writing about the cruelties of slavery, by researchers gathering accounts from formerly enslaved people. But no legal action was taken against the Whitfield family. By 1866, the white Southern establishment was reasserting control through violence and intimidation, and prosecuting elite white families for crimes committed during slavery was politically impossible. The federal government and Northern authorities were focused on larger issues of Reconstruction, and individual cases of enslaved people being killed by their owners were too numerous to prosecute, even if there had been political will to do so. Carolyn Whitfield continued living until 1889, dying at age 62 after outliving her husband and two of her 3 children. Her obituary in the local newspaper described her as a respected member of the community, a woman who had endured the hardships of the Civil War with grace and had helped rebuild her family's fortunes afterward. There was no mention of Samuel, of the babies, of any scandal. The community had collectively agreed to forget or deny what had happened. The Whitfield plantation itself declined over the decades after the war. Without enslaved labor, it was not economically viable, and the family gradually sold off land and property. By 1920, the main house was abandoned and falling into disrepair. It was demolished in 1935, and today nothing remains of Whitfield Hall except some foundation stones and the cemetery where members of the Whitfield family are buried. There is no marker or memorial for Samuel or any of the enslaved people who lived and died there. The case of Caroline and Catherine Whitfield and their exploitation of Samuel reveals uncomfortable truths about slavery that challenge simplified narratives. We often think of slavery primarily as white men exploiting enslaved people, particularly enslaved women. This was certainly the most common pattern, and the sexual violence white men inflicted on enslaved women was systematic and horrific. But slavery gave absolute power to all white people over all enslaved people, and absolute power corrupts in various ways. White women, despite their own subordination within patriarchal society, wielded tremendous power over enslaved people, and some white women abused that power in sexual and psychological ways. The Whitfield twins were not aberrations. Research into slavery has uncovered multiple cases of white women sexually exploiting enslaved men, though such cases were less common than white men raping enslaved women, and were even more thoroughly suppressed and denied. The power dynamic was similar. An enslaved person had no ability to consent or refuse. Any sexual contact initiated by an owner was rape by definition, regardless of the genders involved. Samuel was victimized as surely as any enslaved woman raped by a white master, but his suffering was compounded by the fact that his society would not even acknowledge him as a victim, but would instead treat him as the perpetrator deserving of death. The twins' relationship with each other also reveals pathological dimensions of their behavior. They were not just individually exploiting Samuel, but doing so together, creating a shared experience of domination that seemed to serve psychological needs beyond sexual gratification. There was an element of competition between them, of performance for each other. That suggests their bond was deeply unhealthy long before Samuel entered their lives. The absolute power slavery gave them simply provided an outlet for tendencies that might have manifested differently in another context. The destruction of the evidence, the murder of Samuel, the disposal of the children, all demonstrate how thoroughly the Southern plantation system protected white families even when they committed atrocities. Samuel was killed not because he had done anything wrong, but because his continued existence threatened to expose the scandal. The mixed-race children who were physical evidence of the twins' behavior had to be eliminated or disappeared, because their presence would have been a permanent reminder. And the white family's reputation was preserved through violence and concealment that went unchallenged, because the system was designed to protect white people as interests above all else. The fate of the children haunts this story. If they survived, and if they were sold into slavery, as some accounts suggest, they would have grown up, never knowing who their mothers were, never understanding their origins, bearing the visible markers of mixed ancestry, without knowing how they came to be mixed. If they were killed as infants, they died because their white family found their existence inconvenient. Either way, they were victims of a system that treated human beings as disposable based on race and the circumstances of their birth. Modern understanding of trauma and exploitation allows us to recognize what was done to Samuel as sustained rape and abuse. He was targeted by two women who had absolute power over him, who used that power to sexually exploit him repeatedly over more than a year, who destroyed his psychological well-being, and ultimately had him murdered to protect themselves. This was not a consensual relationship. There was no possibility of consent, given the power imbalance. Samuel's agency was entirely stripped away, his body used for others' gratification, his humanity denied completely. The psychological damage to the twins themselves, while vastly less severe than the harm they inflicted on Samuel, is also worth noting. They had been raised in a society that taught them enslaved people were property, that white people could do whatever they wanted to enslaved people without moral consequence, that power over others was natural and right. Given these teachings and given the absolute power they wielded, their descent into exploitation was almost predictable. This does not excuse their actions, but it contextualizes them within a system designed to produce such outcomes. Catherine's apparent remorse, manifested in her depression and eventual suicide, suggests she had some awareness that what she had done was wrong. But her guilt led to self-destruction rather than any attempt at restitution or acknowledgement. Caroline's hardening into cruelty suggests a different response, an attempt to justify her actions by treating all enslaved people as objects. proving to herself that they were not fully human, and therefore she had not truly harmed anyone who mattered. Both responses were dysfunctional. Both caused further harm. Neither led to justice or healing. The erasure of this story from local history, the collective forgetting that allowed Caroline to die respected and Samuel to die unmourned and unmarked, demonstrates how historical narratives are shaped by power. The Whitfield family had the power to control the official story, to ensure that polite society would not acknowledge the scandal, to make Samuel and the children disappear from record and memory. It was only through the testimony of formerly enslaved people after emancipation that the truth emerged, and even then it was not incorporated into mainstream historical narratives for over a century. Modern historians researching slavery have worked to recover stories like Samuel's, to document the experiences of enslaved people that were deliberately suppressed, to challenge the sanitized narratives of the Old South that persist in some circles. The Whitfield case appears in several academic works about slavery, gender, and power, serving as an example of how the absolute power slavery granted to white people corrupted them in diverse and disturbing ways. But the case remains relatively unknown outside of academic specialists, never taught in schools, rarely mentioned in popular histories. In 2015, a group of descendants of people formerly enslaved at Whitfield Hall organized a remembrance ceremony at the site where the plantation had stood. They erected a small marker acknowledging the enslaved people who had lived and died there, specifically mentioning Samuel by name and noting that he was murdered by his owners. The ceremony was attended by about 30 people, mostly descendants of the enslaved community. No descendants of the Whitfield family attended, and the event received no coverage in local news media. The marker itself was vandalized within a year and eventually removed. The question of how to remember and memorialize cases like this remains contested. Some argue that painful histories should be acknowledged fully, that people like Samuel deserved to have their suffering recognized, that the children born and lost deserve to be mourned, that sanitizing history disrespects the victims and allows us to repeat past mistakes. Others argue that constantly focusing on the worst aspects of history is divisive, that it is better to move forward than to dwell on grievances from the past, that bringing up such cases causes pain without providing benefit. But forgetting history does not heal wounds. It simply ensures that the truth is buried alongside the victims. Samuel died violently, blamed for crimes that were actually committed against him, erased from history as if he never existed. The twins who exploited him faced no legal consequences, and in Caroline's case, lived to old age in comfort. The children disappeared into slavery or death with no acknowledgement of their existence. This is injustice compounded by erasure, and it demands remembering not as an act of revenge, but as an act of honoring those who suffered. The Whitfield case also raises contemporary questions about power, exploitation, and accountability. While slavery as it existed in the 19th century is gone, severe power imbalances still exist in employment relationships, immigration status, economic desperation, and other contexts where some people have vastly more power than others. The mechanisms of exploitation and the tendency of the powerful to escape accountability remain relevant. Understanding historical cases like the Whitfield twins and Samuel helps us recognize contemporary patterns and challenges us to do better. What do you think about this case? How should we remember people like Samuel, who were exploited by those with power and then murdered to protect their exploiters? What responsibility did Caroline and Catherine bear for their actions, given that they were raised in a society that taught them enslaved people were property? How do we balance historical honesty about cases this disturbing with the pain that retelling them causes? And what lessons from this case remain relevant today about power, exploitation, and the importance of holding the powerful accountable? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story disturbed you, if it challenged your understanding of slavery and power, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We explore the darkest corners of history, the stories that make us uncomfortable, the truths that challenge simplified narratives. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is complex and often terrible, that the powerful have always found ways to exploit the powerless, that systems built on inequality create countless victims whose stories deserve to be told. Samuel deserves to be remembered. The children who were born and disappeared deserve to be acknowledged. The formerly enslaved people who witnessed these horrors and later found the courage to testify deserve to have their testimony honored. Hit that subscribe button. Join our community committed to honest historical reckoning, no matter how disturbing, and I'll see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that the truth matters even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. The past shaped the present, and we cannot build a better future without honestly confronting what came before, in all its complexity and horror. Remember Samuel. Speak his name. Honor his suffering by refusing to let his story be erased again.